This is the anchor trend line HPC, which is half price channel swing. So basically we're going to use the price channel and we're going to mark the anchors, and before we can really start the strategy we need to have trend lines drawn. Now the first trend lines to be drawn are going to be diagonals, and in fact those are the only trend lines that are going to be drawn. So the first trend line can only be drawn in the sequence when half the price has moved half a price channel. Now it doesn't matter whether we draw an upward trend line or a downward trend line. What's important is that we have a movement of roughly this height, okay, which is basically 50 pips. Typically our guide is going to be the price channels, because half a price channel by the looks of it from that last drawing is going to be 50 pips. So that's 50 pips, and that's the height we're looking for. So even if we were to start at this point here, we move along, and price kind of just meanders along, and then only at this point here do we have roughly what I would say is a 50 pip move. I don't know the exact number, but that would be the threshold to draw an upward trend line. And like I said, it didn't really matter if it was upward or downward, it just had to move half a price channel height, which is again this height here. So basically that's the point there. So it's moved that height, so now we have permission to draw the trend line. And drawing the first trend line is easy. We simply take the lowest point, which is this point, and the outermost point between where the trend line was drawn, where the threshold price was met. We take the outer points, and there is our first trend line being drawn. Once we have our first trend line drawn, we now are in a position to continue drawing other trend lines, and we can only draw alternating trend lines. In other words, we have to draw an upward trend line and a downward trend line, so in alternate order. So now that we have the upward trend line, we're looking for a downward trend line. Now the upward trend line will continue to be in use until such time is that it is broken by two lower closes, and that's it. Now we can redraw these upward trend lines if they meet the ATR threshold, which is set. Let's say after this point in time we meet a threshold, we can redraw the trend line like that. Eventually it will get broken, so I'm just going to redraw that now. So I'll just move the graph along. Now I don't know what the ATR threshold setting is, but for arguments of illustration purpose, let's say that it is met. So we take the second anchor as the start of the first anchor. We look for the outermost there, and let's say it was broken again because of this distance being, whatever it is. Let's say that was the threshold. Then we can redraw the next one. So you take the second anchor point and make it the first, and look for you. So finally we get a break in the two lower closes, and there they are. Okay, so that's your break in that upward trend line, and now we look for a downward trend line. Okay, so when drawing a downward trend line, following the rules, the first thing we have to do is mark the first anchor, which is the highest anchor, green anchor, in the uptrend line. So the highest green trend anchor in the uptrend line originally was this one over here. Okay, there's your highest green anchor. So now we have the first anchor. Let me mark it. Okay, so now we have the trend line broken. We have the first anchor, which I've marked. First anchor is the highest green anchor in previous uptrend. Okay, so when drawing a downward trend line, the first thing we have to do is find the first anchor. Once we've done that, we find a horizontal stop trend line. This is rule number 3. Before permission given to draw the downward trend line, we draw a horizontal line as the first stop, and it actually happens to be the line of the first anchor. So there's the first anchor. So that would be our stop. Okay, and in this case, we get stopped out. Probably not the best example to start with, but either way, the price would have had to have moved down to this area here, touching the half price channel, halfway mark, or as written by the rules, it must touch at least 3 price channel lines. So it's touched that one, it touched this one, and it doesn't touch anymore. But if it did touch this one, that would suffice. Even if it touched it here, the fact that it touched it 3 times, meaning that the price came up, doesn't matter. The requirement is touching it. Or in the alternative, the half price channel moves half a price channel below the first anchor. In other words, there's your height. So it's got to move at least to that level, somewhere there, or cross this halfway line before you have permission to draw. In this case, it doesn't. We get stopped out, and we move on. So once the price action is broken over here, it was stopped out. We consider this line at this point. We consider that horizontal stop as our downward trend line. So we had our upward trend line, and this would be our downward trend line. Even though, sorry, it's squiggly, but even though it's straight, and it's not really downward, we treat it as a downward trend line because price action didn't move enough down for it to really be drawn properly. So that's our downward trend line. Now we look for an upward trend line, and the rules say when you're drawing an upward trend line, either the previous downward trend line, had there been one, which in this case there isn't, or the horizontal trend line, which there is, has been broken. So that's the first point. So now the second point for an upward trend line is we mark the first anchor, which is the lowest anchor to be drawn, and in the previous trend line. In this case, the previous trend line was actually a horizontal one, and there's your mark. The trend line that we're looking at is actually the one there. And this point here is the lowest anchor, and in this case red, although it's marked white, it's the same as that red one. It's the lowest anchor between that point and this point, which is the previous trend line. So once we've got that, we now look for a movement high enough for us to give us permission to draw the upward trend line, which we will find now. I marked the line, horizontal line, just for ease of reference, and let me just move these so that you can see these. First anchor is that was from the previous one. Then we have our downward trending anchor. Now we are looking to draw the first an upward trend line, and we have our first anchor, which I'm going to mark now. Okay, so I made a few adjustments to the text. This is for a downward trend. That was this one here, okay, but it turned out to be a horizontal. Now for the upward trend, this is the first anchor. It is the lowest red anchor in the previous trend line, which just so happened to be a horizontal one. Okay, so we continue, and the rules state that in order to draw an upward trend line, we must find the first anchor, which we've done. We draw a horizontal stop line. So let's do our horizontal stop, and I'll use this one as a that would be our horizontal stop, and I'll mark it in yellow. Okay, that is our stop. It is basically the stop is the first anchor. They're one and the same. And then number 3, once we've drawn the horizontal stop, we look for permission to draw the upward trend line, which is point number 4, and the price must move at least enough so that it touches 3 price channel quarter lines from the first anchor in the current price. So we see 2 lines have been touched. The first line to have been touched is there. The second line is to be there, or there is no third. So that brings the second part of number 4, half a price channel above the first anchor. So we take this height at the time of the anchor and mark it. I have to check out how big it is, and then we mark it, and that's once price action reaches that level, then we have permission to draw our upward sloping trend line. So let me do that. I'm going to measure the height of the upward sloping line. I'm going to mark it, and that will be our trigger. This will be our trigger to draw the upward sloping line. I'll make that white. There's our trigger. That's our distance. That's our distance, and gives us permission to draw the line, and I'll do that now. So we take the first anchor, outermost anchor, which is that one, and there is our trend line being drawn, and it gets broken around this area here, and that's where we stop that trend line and look for the downward trend line. Okay, I'll pause there. Okay, so we've drawn those, and I just want to draw your attention that we use the anchor points, and even those seem outside of the trend line, they are, we're joining these 2 points and extending them. So for that break, okay. So we move along. Now we're looking for a downward trend line. The first thing that we have to do is draw our. We've got to find our first anchor. Now the first anchor will be up here. Let me mark it. That's our first anchor for the downward trend line. It is the highest green anchor in the previous upward trend. So between these 2 points, between the upward trend that was there and the break, this is the highest point. So that's our starting line. That's our first anchor right there. And then we must have 3 touches of a downward of the price channel line. So we're looking for a break above the trend line, and we get 1, 2. There's 3 touches. Okay, so the 3 touches are the anchor itself is the first touch, the second touch is there, and the third touch is there. Now note that this is probably not a movement of half a price channel. It may be, but the point is that sometimes the price channel will move up, and that's okay. If it does that, it qualifies. Any 3 touches will qualify, and it's touched once, twice, and there's the third touch. So we now qualify for a downward sloping trend line, and we take anchor 1 as the first point and the outermost as the second, and it looks like a pretty flat line, but there it is, and we look for a close above it. If price runs away to the downside, we redraw it, but it looks like it doesn't really, and we have a break somewhere around here, and we now look for our upward sloping trend line. First thing we do is we look for the first anchor. The first anchor will be over here, and we know that because that is the lowest anchor from the previous trend line. The previous trend line is that one over there, which has just been broken. This is the lowest point here, and so we find the first anchor. The second thing we have to do is mark our horizontal stop. I'm just going to borrow this one here and move our stop across. There's our stop, so that's in place. That's the second item, and then the third item, shall I say. And then now we have to get permission to draw the line, which is the price must touch at least 3 price channels from the first anchor. Well, we see the price channel has touched 1 price level, 2, and there's the third. So by the time it's broken, at the same moment it breaks that channel, it's already met the threshold of meeting 3 levels to break. 1, 2, 3. 3 price channels to break, 3 levels, and therefore we get permission to draw the 2 outermost at that point. There's our permission. There's our line, and we draw it until it gets broken, or in the alternative that it is redrawn. So I'm just going to extend that right, and it looks like it's broken over here. Now, one of the rules, this is an interesting point here. We'll notice that redrawing, if you have a anchor that falls outside of the trend line, like we do there, that gives us permission to redraw so long as it hasn't been broken by two lower closes like it is there. So when this anchor forms here, we have to redraw. Why? Because this is outside of the trend line. It's one of those, it happens fairly often. So what I do is we take the extension off, and we now make that the outermost point, like that. Okay, so it's a slight difference, but doesn't really make much change, but in some cases it can. So we move to the next one, but I think at this point we have got the gist of it, so I'm going to pause the video here and then continue the next video if you want it, for ease of reference.